Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that, well, it sparks a lot of discussion and strong opinions. This idea that Islam has some kind of plan to dominate world religion, through population growth and implementing Sharia law in places like London and Paris. It's definitely contentious. So our deep dive today is really about cutting through the noise. We're going to look at the actual sources articles, research, expert analyses, and pull out the key nuggets of knowledge. We want to help you, our listener, understand the different perspectives, the history, the current realities. It's complex. And look, for insights as vital as this, you can always visit Mind Expansion Daily. It's a great place to deepen your understanding of these crucial topics.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating or maybe challenging is how discussions around this often mix things up. You get theology, demographics, politics, all swirled together. Our goal here is to kind of untangle these threads, see what's fact, what's speculation.
Okay, good. So let's start right at the foundation. The theological ideas. Islam as a universal religion meant for everyone. That's a core belief, right? But when people hear universal religion, some might immediately think conquest. What does it actually mean in practice, according to the sources?
That's a really important distinction. So the Quran and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad talk about dawah, which broadly means invitation or call to Islam. And the surprising thing, maybe, for some listeners, is that for mainstream Islamic thought, overwhelmingly, dawah is about peaceful evangelism.
Peaceful.
Yes, it's about inviting people through dialogue. Good example, intellectual engagement, not forcing them. There's that Quranic verse, there shall be no compulsion and acceptance of the religion.
Yeah, 2.256. I've seen that cited.
Exactly. It's fundamental. It underscores free choice. So the goal isn't forced conversion or political rule. It's sharing what they believe is divine truth and establishing communities where Islamic principles can be practiced freely.
Okay, that verse is pretty clear. Peaceful outreach. But, people hear about more aggressive interpretations. How do mainstream scholars address those? Where do they come from?
Right. While the mainstream emphasizes peace, you do have certain extremist Islamist ideologies. Think groups like ISIL, for example.
Yeah.
They do interpret dawah and this universal idea in a much more political, territorial way.
Okay.
They explicitly talk about a global caliphate, imposing their specific view of Sharia, often by force. But, and this is really crucial, these groups are a fringe element. They are widely rejected by the vast majority of Muslim scholars and communities globally. They're outliers.
Outliers, got it. And what about Ummah? That term comes up a lot. Sounds potentially like a unified political force to some ears.
Yeah, Ummah. The global Muslim community. It definitely fosters a strong sense of solidarity, shared identity, across nations, ethnicities. And yes, that can lead to calls for, unity, cooperation between Muslim-majority countries. But the sources are pretty clear. It's generally seen as distinct from some kind of monolithic plan for global political domination. It's more spiritual, communal, a shared identity, not really a political blueprint.
Okay. So theology seems more about invitation and community than conquest, the mainstream at least. But then we get to demographics. And this is where it gets really interesting, doesn't it? Because the idea that Muslim population growth is a deliberate strategy, that's a huge part of the domination narrative. What does the actual data show?
Right, the demographics. Well, the data definitely shows significant growth in Muslim populations in Europe over recent decades. That's true. Islam is the fastest growing religion there. Projections show continued increases. But, and here's the nuance, this growth stems from several factors, not just one single strategy. Well, you've got significant immigration waves from Muslim-majority countries, often driven by economics or post-colonial links or people seeking asylum. Then, yes, on average, higher fertility rates among Muslim women compared to non-Muslim women in Europe, historically speaking.
Okay.
And another key thing, Muslim communities often have a younger median age. Europe's population is generally aging, so a younger population naturally means higher birth rates for a time.
So it sounds like normal demographic shifts may be accelerated by migration. Not necessarily a plot, but that fear of a takeover is still potent for some. What do the academic analyses say about this deliberate strategy claim?
Yeah, sociologically, population growth is it's a natural process. It's influenced by tons of things, socioeconomics, culture, migration history, attributing it all to a deliberate strategy. That usually oversimplifies things massively. It can veer into conspiracy theories like Eurabia.
Eurabia. Yeah, I've heard that term.
Right. And academic analyses generally dismiss that. They see it as, frankly, Islamophobic and not based on facts. They point out that, yes, the Muslim population will grow, but predictions of actual Muslim majorities across Europe aren't supported by the data, especially because, over time, as groups integrate, fertility rates tend to decline. They converge towards the norm in the host country. We see that pattern with many immigrant groups.
So for the average Muslim family, having more kids isn't some grand political statement. It's personal.
Cultural. Exactly. For most, it's a personal choice, maybe cultural preference, sometimes linked to religious teachings encouraging procreation. But it's very rarely framed within mainstream communities themselves as some conscious collective political strategy for a demographic takeover. That interpretation tends to come from outside observers, people viewing demographic change with, suspicion or alarm.
Okay, that clarifies the population angle quite a bit. Let's build on that. The other big point of contention, Sharia law. The concern that Muslim communities, say in London or Paris, want their own governance, want to practice Sharia widely. Can you break down what Sharia even is first and how it actually functions in the West?
Sure. Sharia literally means something like the clear path to water. It's a broad system of Islamic law, derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet Muhammad's teachings and practices. But it's not like a single book of laws. It's a body of principles. Interpretations vary between different schools of thought.
Okay, so not monolithic.
Not at all. And in Western countries, when people talk about Sharia, it usually concerns two distinct areas. First, personal and family matters, things like marriage, divorce, inheritance. Many Muslims do want to resolve these kinds of disputes according to Islamic principles. So in the UK, for example, you have Sharia councils. They operate voluntarily. They mediate family issues.
Voluntarily. So their rulings aren't automatically state law.
No, their decisions are only legally binding if, say, they get incorporated into a civil court order, or if both parties willingly agree to abide by them under arbitration rules, like the UK's Arbitration Act. Now, proponents say they offer a culturally relevant way to resolve things. Critics, though, raise concerns. Sometimes rulings might clash with equality principles, women's rights especially, or issues like polygamy, which is illegal under UK civil law anyway.
Right, and the second area,
Yeah.
the more controversial one.
That's the concern about Sharia becoming a parallel legal system, something that challenges the supremacy of national secular law. That's the bigger fear for critics.
And do mainstream Muslim organizations actually push for that? A parallel system?
Well, again, extremist groups definitely do. They explicitly call for replacing state law with their version of Sharia. But mainstream Muslim organizations, leaders in Europe, they generally affirm quite consistently their commitment to respecting the laws of the land. When they call for religious freedom, it's typically about being able to practice their faith without unfair restrictions within the existing legal system. Not about replacing it. Remember Boris Johnson, when he was London mayor, always saying only one law applies here.
Okay. That distinction is important. So what about this idea of own governance then, or parallel societies? People point to areas with high Muslim populations as evidence.
Yeah, that idea often comes from misinterpretations, or maybe fear. Look, in big European cities, immigrant groups, not just Muslims, naturally tend to form communities, enclaves. You get concentrations of specific groups. They set up their own shops, cultural centers, mosques. It serves the residents.
Common for many immigrant groups, right?
Absolutely. It reflects a desire for cultural preservation, community support. It's not inherently an attempt to set up independent political zones. Now, critics sometimes do see these areas as parallel societies, places where integration isn't happening. But many sources also highlight the opposite. High levels of civic and political participation by Muslims in European democracies.
How so?
They vote, they run for office, they're involved in civil society, just like other citizens. Surveys often show Muslims identify strongly with both their religious identity and their national citizenship. It's not always either. Those isolated incidents you hear about sometimes, like Sharia zone declarations in Tower Hamlets, or vigilante stuff in Paris suburbs, they are typically just that. Isolated incidents, they get condemned by authorities and, importantly, by mainstream Muslim leaders, too. They don't represent some widespread push for territorial control or separate governance, more like provocative acts by fringe elements.
So the reality on the ground seems much more complex than the headlines often suggest. If we kind of zoom out, connect this to the bigger picture, what's driving the current conversations about Islam in the West? What are the ongoing challenges?
It's a mix of things, really. Several factors are definitely shaping the discourse. Sadly, acts of terrorism carried out by individuals or groups claiming an Islamic motive, they have fueled suspicion. Islamophobia. It makes it harder for the public to differentiate between mainstream Muslim communities and these violent extremist ideologies.
Yeah, it definitely muddies the waters.
Then you have the rise of right-wing populist parties across Europe. Often their rhetoric is strongly anti-immigration and frequently targets Muslims specifically, framing their presence as a threat. There are also ongoing debates about freedom of expression versus religious sensitivity. Cartoons, blasphemy issues, religious symbols in public spaces.
Right, those create a lot of tension.
They really do. They pit secular values against religious sensitivities. And finally, European governments are still grappling with integration. How best to integrate Muslim minorities while upholding national values. You see different approaches. France's strict secularism, laïcité. The UK's more multicultural model. Each approach faces its own challenges.
So pulling all this together then, what's the bottom line from our deep dive? This narrative about a grand plan for domination via population and Sharia, it exists for sure, but our look at the sources suggests it often, well, exaggerates, misrepresents.
I think that's fair to say. It often paints with a very broad, inaccurate brush. Mainstream Islamic theology, it emphasizes dawah as peaceful invitation, ummah as a spiritual bond, not political conquest. The demographic shifts, they're real, but they're complex sociological trends, not just some strategic plot. And integration often lowers fertility rates anyway. And the desire for Sharia in the West, mostly about personal, family matters. Seeking accommodation within existing laws, not replacing them. Those isolated incidents or the rhetoric from extremist groups, they just don't reflect the reality for the vast, diverse majority of Muslims.
Which raises a crucial question for all of us, doesn't it? How do we talk about these complex issues, integration, religion, identity, without falling for oversimplifications or alarmist narratives?
Exactly. It really demands a nuanced approach. We need to separate legitimate concerns about social cohesion, about integration challenges, from those unfounded, often fearful narratives. And crucially, distinguish between the huge diversity within Islam itself, different interpretations, different practices.
It's about looking deeper than the headlines, finding those sometimes surprising truths we talked about. Well, this has been incredibly insightful. If you, our listener, found this deep dive valuable, please do take a second to like this episode and subscribe to Mind Expansion Daily. That way you won't miss out on more discussions like this. And we really want to hear from you on this one. It's a complex topic, we know. Do you agree or disagree with our summary based on the sources? Leave a comment below. Let us know your thoughts. We look forward to exploring more fascinating topics with you next time.